Welcome, everyone, to today's deep dive.
Oh,
Right now, I am looking across the table at it's this massive digital backdrop. We've got shifting topographic maps, satellite overlays, and all these property boundaries glowing in red and green. And my co-host is just sitting in front of all this, taking meticulous notes. It honestly looks like a war room in here.
yeah, it really does feel like one, especially when you start reading through this material. What we're actually looking at today is a really dense stack of operational trigger maps, legislative reviews, Senate inquiry updates, and strategic policy memos. And it's all centered around land management in New South Wales.
Right. And the mission of this deep dive today is to untangle what has basically become an incredibly complex, really high-stakes web of environmental regulations. We're going to decode how the act of just, routine farming in Australia has somehow transformed into this federal compliance minefield.
Exactly. It's a huge shift.
And, hey, if you are listening to this right now and thinking, well, I don't own a farm, so why do I care? You need to pay close attention, because this is a fascinating masterclass in how data, surveillance, and overlapping government jurisdictions are completely redefining the very concept of private property.
Yeah, it's fundamentally a story about where we draw the line between what an individual actually owns and what the broader public interest demands of that land. So to understand the traps that these landholders are falling into, we first have to understand who is actually in charge of the dirt.
Right. Who's the boss?
Exactly. And it's not just a single authority, it's actually a three-layer system.
Okay, let's unpack this, because reading through these sources, the dynamic between all the different levels of government just seems incredibly convoluted.
It is. We can break it down into a sort of regulatory three-layer cake. So
Okay.
layer one is the farm itself. That's you, the landholder.
Okay.
You're operating a business, you need to manage weeds, clear fence lines, maybe adjust some irrigation. Then layer two is the state system.
Right, the state government.
Yeah. In New South Wales, this is usually Local Land Services, or LLS. They handle all the day-to-day permits, the regional codes, the state-level biodiversity rules. And for decades, they have basically been the primary interface for agriculture.
Which makes intuitive sense, right? Like, you have land in a specific state, you deal with that state's land management department.
You'd think so. But then there is layer three, which is the federal system. This is governed by the EPBC Act, so that's the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act.
Okay.
And this federal layer just sits over everything, and it's often totally invisible to the landholder until a specific threshold gets crossed.
Okay, wait. I want to make sure I have the mechanics of this right.
Yep.
Because it sounds like having two bosses. So the middle manager, which is the state, evaluates your project, looks at their specific state guidelines, and gives you written permission to go ahead.
Yeah.
You follow all their rules, but the CEO, the federal government, can just step in at the 11th hour, completely halt the project, and fire you or fine you based on a completely different set of federal rules, regardless of what the middle manager said.
Yeah, that analogy captures the structural friction perfectly. The CEO's rulebook is governed by what the documents call the master rule. So the federal EPBC Act is triggered when an action has a real chance or possibility of a significant impact on a matter of national environmental significance.
A real chance or possibility.
Yeah, they abbreviate that as MNES.
I noticed that specific phrasing in the legal reviews, actually. Real chance or possibility. Because it doesn't say a certainty.
No, it
It
doesn't.
doesn't even say a high probability.
Exactly. The legal threshold is explicitly not a greater than 50% probability. A real chance, even if it's a minority probability, is sufficient to trigger it.
Wow.
Yeah, and if that threshold is met regarding something like a threatened species, a Ramsar wetland, or migratory species habitat, then the federal government has jurisdiction.
Wait, Ramsar, that's an international treaty designation, right?
Yes, exactly.
So we are talking about wetlands that have been classified as having global ecological significance, not just like a local duck pond on someone's property.
Right, that's a really important distinction to make. The federal government's jurisdiction is tied to these overarching national and international obligations. But the friction actually happens in the daily implementation of all this. The operational maps outline these things called Trigger 5 and Trigger 6.
Okay, what are those?
So Trigger 5 is a controlled action determination. That just means the federal minister decides a project needs their specific approval.
Got it.
But Trigger 6 is where the system really grinds its gears. That is Commonwealth state disagreement.
Oh boy. So if New South Wales evaluates a paddock and says, this clearing is totally fine under our state biodiversity laws, but the Commonwealth decides that the exact same clearing has a real chance of impacting a federally listed species.
The Commonwealth wins every time.
So the state approval is just voided.
Yeah, the Commonwealth's legislation overrides the state. The state approval instantly becomes irrelevant in the eyes of the federal regulator. So the landholder is suddenly subject to federal stop work orders, potential compliance actions, all of it.
Even if they're holding a valid state permit in their hand.
Even then.
Man, that structural overlap just seems like a logistical nightmare. But how does the Commonwealth evaluate what counts as a significant impact on a daily basis?
Yeah.
I mean, they can't possibly have environmental officers monitoring every single fence line being cleared across millions of hectares of Australian farmland.
No, they don't. And this brings us to a really specific line drawn in the dirt, which stems from the December 2025 EPBC amendments.
Right.
Historically, the legislation included an agricultural exemption for continuing use. So if a landholder was maintaining the historical intensity of their farming, basically just continuing the established practices on that specific property, they were generally exempt from federal intervention.
So that's the basic, hey, I'm just doing what we've always done to keep the farm running defense.
Exactly. But the new amendments shifted that entire paradigm. The burden of proof has totally moved. Now, the landholder has to formally demonstrate that their routine actions are not having a significant impact.
Oh, wow. Guilty until proven innocent, basically.
Administratively, yeah. And to manage this, the federal department instituted a new threshold, which is the 15-year rule.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because when you look at the 15-year rule on paper, it seems like, a neat administrative boundary.
Yeah.
But applying it to actual ecology feels completely disconnected from reality.
Well, the mechanism of the rule dictates that if vegetation regrowth on a property is under 15 years old, the landholder can generally self-assess their clearing activities.
Right.
But the moment that regrowth crosses the 15-year mark, it transitions in the eyes of the law. It's no longer considered mere regrowth. It's now categorized as potential mature habitat. And any interference with it has to be referred to the federal department for assessment.
I have to push back on the practicality of this. Because let's say I'm managing a property, right? And I have this patch of scrub that is 14 years and 11 months old. Under this rule, I can fire up the machinery, do my routine management, and I am perfectly compliant.
Yes, technically.
But 1 month later, that exact same patch of scrub crosses the 15-year threshold. It magically acquires federal protection status, and touching it without a federal referral is a compliance breach. Like, how is a landholder supposed to track the exact birth date of billions of trees across a massive agricultural operation?
They're asking the exact same question. The agricultural sector is raising immense concerns about the feasibility of tracking that timeline, particularly because ecology isn't static.
Right.
The sources outline how this plays out in different regions, using these terms safe envelopes and red zones. Take the Moree and Wee-Waa region, for example.
Okay.
The trap there involves brigalow regrowth.
Okay, what's brigalow?
Brigalow is a specific type of acacia tree that suckers aggressively from its root system.
Meaning it constantly shoots up new growth, even after it's been cleared.
Yeah, it creates this continuous cycle of regrowth. So a landholder might look at a paddock and just see scrubby routine regrowth that needs managing. But brigalow is a federally listed, critically endangered ecological community.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Because of its protected status, interacting with it, even if the landholder firmly believes it's young regrowth, requires verifying its exact age and ecological status, or they risk triggering the EPBC Act.
And the sources show this isn't just about cutting down trees either. There's a totally different mechanism at play down in the Griffith area, the Murrumbidgee irrigation area.
Right, the MIA. What's fascinating there is the hydrology trap. In the MIA, a landholder might be conducting standard earthworks, maybe just altering a drainage ditch to improve their irrigation efficiency. They aren't clearing a single native tree.
Right, just moving dirt.
Just moving dirt. But if altering that drain changes the flow of water, and that water eventually reaches a downstream wetland that holds federal protection.
Let me guess. Trigger.
Exactly. That alteration can be classified as a significant impact.
So the action on your private property doesn't even have to physically touch the protected environment. The secondary effect, which could be miles away, triggers the federal intervention.
Yeah, water connects everything.
That is wild. But this brings me back to the logistical question from earlier. If a landholder in an incredibly remote area clears a 16-year-old patch of brigalow or alters a drain that shifts water flow, How does a bureaucrat in a federal office hundreds of kilometers away even know the landscape changed?
Well, that introduces Trigger 4 from the operational memos. Department detection via satellite imagery and data analytics.
We are literally talking of remote surveillance.
We are. The regulatory framework is no longer reliant on a traditional permission-based system, where a person submits an application, a human reviews it, an inspector visits the site.
Right, the old way.
Yeah, it has completely evolved into an outcome-based continuous surveillance model. The government utilizes automated land clearing change detection software.
Okay, so algorithms.
Exactly. These algorithms analyze spectral signatures and historical satellite baselines to detect changes in canopy density or ground cover. They're essentially automating that 15-year clock.
So it's mapping the entire continent's vegetation changes in real time.
Yes. And environmental NGOs are now utilizing this exact same publicly available satellite data, too. They run their own independent monitoring of land clearing. And when their algorithms detect a change that correlates with a protected habitat map, they submit third-party referrals.
Wow.
Yeah, they basically flag those specific properties to the federal department for investigation.
So it's a completely decentralized network of surveillance. You have government algorithms and third-party organizations just constantly monitoring private property boundaries from space.
It goes even further than that with the establishment of Environment Information Australia, or the EIA. The documents note this is commencing operations in July 2026. This represents the total federalization of ecological data. See, historically, landholders voluntarily provided really detailed, granular ecological data about their properties to local land care groups or the State Biodiversity Conservation Trust.
The BCT.
Yes, the BCT.
And they did this to participate in local conservation efforts, right? Like to help map local species populations or secure grants for environmental improvements on their own land.
Exactly. But they participated under strict assurances of confidentiality. The understanding was always that the data would be used for localized conservation, not for regulation. But under the new framework, that historical voluntarily provided data can now be legally reclassified as national environmental information asset.
Wait, I'm trying to wrap my head around this data sharing. It feels like, okay, imagine giving your highly detailed medical history to a research charity because you really want to help them cure a disease. But then, under a new law, that charity is legally required to hand your entire file over to your health insurance company, who then uses it to adjust your premiums or just completely deny your coverage. Is that what the agricultural sector is arguing is happening here?
That is exactly the core of their grievance regarding data sovereignty. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the entire philosophy of environmental data governance has shifted to open by default. There is no statutory farm privacy exemption in Australia.
Wow.
So a map of a threatened parrot nesting site that a landholder willingly provided to a local conservation group 5 years ago that can now be transferred directly to the new Federal Environmental Protection Agency, the NEPA.
And the NEPA can use that historical data map to issue a compliance order today, demanding the landholder protect that specific area, even if the rules were totally different when they originally provided the data.
Exactly. And the Senate inquiry updates in these sources quantify the sheer administrative burden this creates. Because that burden of proof has shifted, landholders are facing 70-hour self-assessments.
70 hours.
70 hours. Just to document that their routine activities are not triggering these complex federal thresholds.
That is almost 2 full work weeks of administrative work just to verify you can clear a fence line or fix a drain.
And if they try to hire an environmental consultant to navigate all this, the overlapping state codes, the 15-year satellite baselines, the federal EPBC triggers the inquiry notes, there is a severe shortage of qualified professionals.
Of course there is.
And when they can actually secure one, it's costing approximately $25,000 per assessment.
That is a massive financial barrier before a single tractor is even turned on. I mean, when you aggregate this, right, the $25,000 compliance costs, the invisible 15-year timeline traps, the automated satellite surveillance, and the repurposing of historical data, it creates a deeply volatile environment.
Which really explains why the sources detail a massive legal counterstrike being organized by the agriculture sector. Yeah, they are not taking this lying down. The National Farmers Federation, the NFF, is executing a highly coordinated legal strategy. And what's fascinating here is that they aren't just arguing about the science of tree ages or hydrology anymore.
What are they doing?
They have elevated this to a constitutional challenge. It's centered entirely around Section 51 of the Australian Constitution.
Okay, constitutional law. We are officially moving from the dirt to the High Court. How does Section 51 work in this context?
It revolves around the concept of just terms. In the Australian legal system, state governments possess really broad constitutional powers to restrict how an individual uses their land. And crucially, they generally do not have to pay compensation for those restrictions.
Okay.
So if New South Wales changes a local zoning law that limits what you can build, they don't owe you money for the lost potential value.
Similar to how, like, a city council can rezone a commercial street to residential, and the property owners just have to absorb that change.
Exactly, but the federal government operates under different constitutional constraints. Under Section 51, if the Commonwealth acquires property, it is constitutionally mandated to provide just terms compensation.
So state governments can regulate property for free, but if the federal government steps in and acquires it, they have to pay market value.
Right.
But hold on, state governments rezone land and restrict property all the time. Why would the NFF think the federal government has to pay them just because the environmental rules got stricter? Making a rule isn't the same as physically acquiring the deed to the farm.
Well, this raises an incredibly important question about legal precedent. Historically, there was a landmark test case regarding this exact tension known as the Peter Spencer case.
Okay, who was Peter Spencer?
He was a landholder who argued that the federal government owed him compensation because state-level land clearing laws severely diminished the value and operational capacity of his farm.
What was his specific legal argument, though? How did he connect the state laws to the federal government?
He argued that the state governments only passed those restrictive land clearing laws to help the federal government meet its international climate treaty obligations, specifically the Kyoto Protocol targets. So he claimed the states were essentially acting as legislative puppets for a federal agenda, and therefore it was effectively a federal acquisition.
I mean, it sounds like a logical deduction. Did the court agree?
The High Court ruled against him. They determined there was no direct, enforceable legal link. There was no legislative smoking gun proving the federal government forced the state to enact those specific laws.
Got it.
Because it was enacted via state legislation, it was deemed a state-level regulation, not a federal acquisition, meaning no compensation was required.
But the landscape we just mapped out is entirely different. We aren't talking about the federal government politely asking the states to pass laws anymore. We are talking about Trigger 5, Trigger 6, and the Commonwealth having direct override power to void state permits.
And that is the crux of the NFF's new strategy. The recent EPBC amendments, combined with the rollout of National Environmental Standards, or NEMS, fundamentally alters the mechanics of power here. The Commonwealth is no longer exerting indirect influence. It has established ultimate, direct veto authority over state-level land management decisions.
So the NFF is arguing that the federal government is now holding the smoking gun directly.
Yes. They are arguing that this direct, enforceable federal control crosses the line from mere regulation into a regulatory taking. The legal framing is actually quite sophisticated.
How so?
They are positing that if the federal government mandates that a landholder must permanently maintain a specific patch of mature habitat, for instance, legally preventing them from clearing those 16-year-old trees we discussed earlier, the government is effectively placing an environmental easement on that private land.
An easement. We usually hear that term when, like, a utility company takes a legal right to a strip of your yard to run power lines, or a neighboring property has a right-of-way across your driveway. It's a recognized, compensable property right.
Exactly. If the courts accept the argument that a federally...
That would completely upend the federal budget. I mean, every time the government determines a piece of land is necessary to protect a threatened bird or maintain a wetland buffer, they couldn't just pass a rule. They would have to literally purchase that ecological outcome from the landholder at market value.
It is a profound constitutional standoff over a very simple question. Who bears the financial cost of producing public environmental goods? Does the individual landholder absorb the cost through restricted operational capacity, or does the public absorb the cost through taxpayer-funded compensation?
So what does this all mean when we pull it all together? Let's summarize the incredible scope of this deep dive. We started by looking at a landholder navigating a state-level permit, thinking they were fully compliant with the rules. Then we explore the mechanics of the federal override, the 15-year rule, and how the burden of proof has entirely shifted. We mapped out how satellite algorithms and open-source data have created a continuous surveillance grid, repurposing historical voluntary information into potential compliance mechanisms. And all of this logistical and technological friction is culminating in a Supreme Court-level constitutional battle over the definition of an environmental easement.
A lot.
It really is. And to you, listening to this is why these seemingly dry regulatory documents matter. We are analyzing a live collision between two absolute undeniable necessities. On one side, we have a scientifically critical international mandate to protect threatened species and halt biodiversity loss. On the other side, we have the property rights and operational realities of the agricultural sector tasked with actually producing our food.
Yeah.
And this collision is occurring in an era where perfect digital surveillance forces every single interaction with the natural world to be tracked, logged, and regulated.
It's a highly precarious balance. And just to build on that, there is one final fascinating concept detailed in the sources that we haven't fully explored today, but it really highlights where this is all heading next.
Oh, what's that?
The new Nature Repair Act. It establishes a framework where biodiversity certificates, the very assessments generated by state bodies like the BCT, can be utilized for federal offsetting.
Wait, meaning that if a corporation builds a highway and destroys habitat, they can buy these certificates from a farm to legally offset their destruction?
Yes. It means that a patch of remnant vegetation on a private property is no longer just a physical piece of nature. It is actively being transitioned into a highly regulated, tradable financial currency within a national ecological stock market.
That is wow.
It forces us to ask what happens to our fundamental relationship with the natural world when conservation is entirely financialized. You know, when a property isn't just viewed as agricultural land, but as a bank vault of ecological credits being leveraged and traded by external corporations to offset their own industrial impacts.
That reframes everything we've talked about today. The landscape isn't just being regulated, it's being financialized. So the next time you look at a topographic map or observe the grid of farmland from the window of an airplane, remember the complexity underneath it all. You aren't just looking at dirt, water, and trees. You are looking at a continuous digital surveillance grid, an active constitutional battlefield, and the foundation of a brand new ecological stock market. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.